At its peak, this company controlled roughly 90% of oil refining in the United States. So, its founder became the richest man in modern history, with a fortune at one point equal to nearly 1.5% of the entire American economy, a share of national wealth no one, not even the richest billionaires of today, has matched since. In 1911, the United States Supreme Court ordered the company broken apart, ruling it had become an illegal monopoly. And yet, within a few years of that ruling, its founder had somehow become even richer than before the breakup. This is the story of John D. Rockefeller and Standard Oil. Oil, and how the exact same strategy that built history's most dominant monopoly, is what triggered the government response that destroyed it, and then, ironically, made its founder wealthier than ever. To understand how Standard Oil became so dominant that the government felt it had no choice but to break it apart, you first have to understand the industry it emerged from, and just how chaotic that industry was before Rockefeller got involved. In the 1860s, the American oil industry was in its earliest, most disorganized years. Oil had recently been discovered in Pennsylvania, and a chaotic rush of small, undercapitalized refineries had sprung up to process it, most operating with unpredictable quality and constantly fluctuating prices. It was a young, unstable industry with no dominant player and no real standardization. In 1870, a Cleveland businessman named John D. Rockefeller incorporated Standard Oil with $1 million in capital, with a clear philosophy. The chaos and inefficiency in oil refining wasn't a permanent feature of the industry. It was an opportunity to consolidate, standardize, and control it entirely. Rockefeller's strategy for consolidation was aggressive from the very beginning. In 1872, Standard Oil quietly participated in an arrangement with major railroads that gave the company secret, favorable shipping rates unavailable to competitors. An arrangement that dramatically lowered Standard Oil's costs relative to every other refiner in the country. Around the same period, in what later became known as the Cleveland Massacre, Rockefeller moved rapidly to acquire or force out competing refineries in his home city, absorbing the vast majority of Cleveland's refining capacity in a matter of weeks. This pattern repeated across the country through the 1870s and 1880s. Standard Oil would approach a competing refinery, often with detailed knowledge of that competitor's exact costs thanks to Standard Oil's superior rail rates and market intelligence, and offer to buy them out, a proposition made easier by the fact that competitors who refused often found themselves unable to compete on price at all. By the 1880s, Standard Oil had absorbed such an overwhelming share of American oil refining that competition, in any meaningful sense, barely existed anymore. In 1882, Rockefeller and his partners formalized this dominance into an entirely new kind of legal structure, the Standard Oil Trust, one of the first major business trusts in American history. The trust structure let Rockefeller coordinate dozens of formally separate companies across different states as a single, unified entity, sidestepping laws that restricted a company from owning businesses across state lines directly. By the 1890s, Standard Oil controlled an estimated 90% of American oil refining capacity, and Rockefeller had become, by a wide margin, the wealthiest private citizen in the country. The same relentless consolidation strategy that had built this empire, buy out or crush anyone who competes, standardize the entire industry under one roof, had made Standard Oil more powerful than any single company in America had ever been. It had also made Standard Oil an extremely visible and increasingly resented target. Standard Oil's dominance did not go unnoticed. Public resentment toward the company's tactics had been building for years, driven largely by the independent refiners and oil producers Standard Oil had squeezed out or absorbed along the way, many of whom felt they'd had no real choice but to sell. That resentment found its most powerful voice in journalist Ida Tarbell, whose father had been among the independent oil producers affected by Standard Oil's rise. Beginning in 1902, Tarbell published a meticulously researched, multi-part investigative series exposing the specifics of Standard Oil's rebate deals, competitive tactics, and internal operations in unprecedented detail, later compiled into her 1904 book, The History of the Standard Oil Company. It became one of the most influential pieces of investigative journalism in American history, turning public opinion sharply against the company and fueling a growing political movement toward antitrust enforcement. The federal government took notice. Using the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, a law passed specifically to prevent exactly this kind of market dominance, the U.S. government filed suit against Standard Oil in 1906, arguing the company's trust structure amounted to an illegal restraint of trade. Here's the irony sitting at the center of this story. The exact same strategy that had made Standard Oil so efficient and so dominant, aggressively consolidating an entire industry under one coordinated structure, was, by definition, the very thing that made it a monopoly in the eyes of the law. Rockefeller hadn't built Standard Oil by breaking any law that existed when he started. He'd built it so successfully that the government had to write new laws just to be able to stop it. The case worked its way through the federal court system for years. In 1911, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled decisively against Standard Oil, finding that the company did constitute an illegal monopoly under the Sherman Antitrust Act, and ordered it broken apart into 34 separate, independent companies. On paper, this should have been a catastrophic outcome for Rockefeller, the dismantling of the very empire he'd spent 4 decades building. Rockefeller, by that point mostly retired from daily operations, held shares not in Standard Oil as a single entity, but proportionally across all 34 of the newly separated companies created by the breakup. What happened next surprised almost everyone. Freed from the antitrust scrutiny and public backlash that had weighed on Standard Oil as a single, dominant entity, several of the individual successor companies, including what would eventually become Exxon, Mobil, and Chevron, grew rapidly and independently, each building substantial value of their own in the booming early 20th century oil industry. Because Rockefeller held a proportional stake across all of them, the combined value of his shares across the 34 companies rose significantly within just a few years of the breakup, reportedly making him wealthier than he had been as the head of the unified Standard Oil Trust. By some historical estimates, Rockefeller's fortune peaked shortly after the Standard Oil breakup, at a level equivalent to roughly 1.5% of the entire American economy at the time, a concentration of personal wealth relative to the national economy that remains virtually unmatched by any individual since, including the wealthiest people in the world today. Many of the 34 companies created by the 1911 breakup remain recognizable today, decades of subsequent mergers later, as Exxon, Chevron, Marathon, and other major energy companies, meaning Standard Oil, in a fragmented but very real sense, never actually disappeared. It simply became dozens of companies instead of one. Ida Tarbell, whose investigative work had helped trigger the antitrust case in the first place, continued a long career in journalism, and is widely regarded today as one of the founding figures of American investigative reporting. Standard Oil's story isn't really about oil. It's about what happens when a strategy built entirely around total consolidation succeeds so completely that it becomes indistinguishable from the exact behavior the law exists to prevent, and how sometimes even the harshest legal punishment available doesn't actually destroy the wealth behind it, because the individual pieces, once freed to compete independently, can end up worth even more than the whole. It's a pattern that shows up again and again in business history. The very dominance that makes a company nearly unstoppable is often the same dominance that forces regulators to eventually step in. And the outcome of that intervention doesn't always look like the defeat everyone expects it to be. If you'd like to understand the hidden forces shaping our global economy, help us by subscribing to our channel.